The family's bankruptcy forced Asher into an arranged marriage with the eldest Hawthorne son, but he found himself entangled with the man's younger brother instead. Late one night, Leo pinned him against a wall, his breath hot and laced with alcohol. He insisted that the old cripple was useless, promising that he would be the one to cherish Asher. Just then, the so-called lame old man appeared, pushing a wheelchair that he then elegantly rose from. A cool voice cut through the tension, questioning if Leo's hopes were not perhaps misplaced. He also wondered aloud if stealing his husband right in front of him was not, in fact, profoundly disrespectful. After his family's fortune evaporated, Asher had no choice but to follow his parents' arrangement for a union with the Hawthornes. The eldest son, Julian, was rumored to be disabled, a man of mercurial temperament and peculiar tastes, with whispers suggesting he preferred men. Yet, the sheer scale of the Hawthorne wealth meant there was no shortage of suitors. For reasons unknown, the family had extended an offer directly to Asher. The only connection Asher had to the Hawthornes was his degenerate ex-boyfriend, a man who shared the same last name but was, as far as Asher knew, penniless. Asher Collins, known throughout his social circle as a libertine who moved through lovers without a single attachment, was holding court at his own bachelor party. He slurred to his friends that if it weren't for the Hawthorne money, he wouldn't give the man a second glance. Glass after glass of scotch went down, numbing the edges of his consciousness. Thoughts of his shattered family, his sick mother, his domineering father, his sister still in college, and the ever-present Crores, made him swallow back the bitterness. His friend Caleb shouted over the music, trying to find a silver lining by reminding him that at least the man was rich. Another friend, who had supposedly seen him, added to the grim portrait, describing a man scarred and ruthless. A killer who kept a pair of vicious Dobermans on his estate and fed his enemies to them. Asher shoved his bottle toward the friend's mouth, telling him to drink if he couldn't say anything useful. Caleb simply blinked and took a long pull from the bottle, mumbling that he was just worried. Asher and Caleb were birds of a feather, partners in crime since childhood. Caleb's family had lost their fortune years ago. Now it was Asher's turn. A true brotherhood of the fallen. Looking closely, Asher noticed Caleb was actually quite handsome, with a solid build. He mused aloud about the two of them just getting together. The suggestion made Caleb recoil, shaking his head and insisting they were incompatible in that way. Besides, he added, he could never measure up to Asher's standards, claiming his list of ex-boyfriends could stretch from New York to California. Asher leaned in closer, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. Caleb's features were fine, his lips full, and his body lean and athletic, a highly sought-after type in their circles. Asher gave him a suggestive look, remarking that he wasn't opposed to changing his preferences for love, his hand drifting toward Caleb's thigh. Caleb suddenly leaped to his feet, whispering urgently and gesturing with his chin toward the back of the room where, he claimed, a perfect specimen had just been spotted. Asher turned. A man was looking their way, and the moment their eyes met, Asher's heart skipped a beat. On any other night, he would have been over there in a second. But his wedding was the next day. He had no desire to be caught in a compromising position on his first day as a Hawthorne. He turned back to his drink. Several drinks later, his bladder screaming for relief, Asher staggered toward the restrooms. There, at the marble sinks, was the same striking man. The alcohol loosened his tongue, and all the frustration and resentment of the past weeks came pouring out. Before he knew it, he had pressed the man against the wall of a stall, their bodies flushed together in the cramped space. Heat radiated between them, fogging Asher's mind. The stranger was the physical embodiment of his every fantasy. He reached out and squeezed the firm muscle of the man's chest, a satisfying thrill running through him. He hooked a finger under the man's chin and lamented that it was a shame he couldn't indulge himself tonight, because on any other day, he would have already taken him by force. The man merely raised an eyebrow, a silent challenge. Asher had been with many men, but none possessed the magnetic pull of this one. He darted in and stole a quick, hard kiss from his sensuous lips before pulling back. He declared that he would have already had his way with him. Then, composing himself, he pushed the man away and went to the sink, splashing his face with cold water. He couldn't be reckless. The Hawthorne bailout was the only thing keeping his family afloat. The Crores had granted a 2-month extension purely on the strength of the Hawthorne name. If this marriage fell through, his family was finished. The man followed him out, smoothing the lapels of his bespoke suit. The suit was a masterpiece of tailoring from a designer so exclusive Asher couldn't get an appointment even when his family still had money. The man stated blandly that his last name was Hawthorne. Asher felt a pang of regret. He mumbled about the coincidence, wondering aloud how it was fair that all the handsome Hawthornes were taken, while he was stuck with one who was notoriously hideous. He fled the restroom, knowing that another second in the man's presence would shatter his already fragile self-control. The first day of his new life began with a splash of cold water. At the wedding, Julian Hawthorne was a no-show. His younger brother, Leo, stood in for him, guiding Asher through the entire ceremony. Leo introduced himself with a dazzling smile, explaining that his brother had been unavoidably detained. He took Asher's hand, and under the astonished gazes of the guests, slid a ring onto his finger. A wedding between two men was already unconventional enough, but having the groom's brother act as a stand-in was unheard of. Yet, the power of the Hawthorne name silenced any potential objections. The whispers were merciless, speculating on what kind of luck, good or bad, had brought Asher to this ostentatious farce. Drones buzzed overhead, a film crew documenting every moment. After the exchange of rings, Leo even kissed the back of Asher's hand, leaning in to whisper in his ear. He told Asher he looked beautiful, just as he had in his dreams. Leo wore a white suit identical to Asher's, complete with a boutonniere, looking every bit the groom. Asher could only manage a rigid smile, hissing at Leo to stop his insane performance. He couldn't believe it. Leo was Julian's brother. He had been with Leo for 3 years and had never known. When they met, Leo had been a penniless nobody, or so Asher thought. To be precise, Asher had been paying his way for 3 years. Leo was good-looking and skilled in bed, and the monthly allowance Asher gave him was generous, but it was pocket change compared to the Hawthorne fortune. The bizarre ceremony finally ended. A servant led him to the marital suite to rest. Exhausted, Asher fell into bed, not caring whether the great Julian Hawthorne would appear. It would be better if he didn't. The thought of servicing a cripple, no matter how skilled he might be, was unappealing. In the depths of a dream, he felt someone kissing him. He sat up and swung a hand, connecting with a sharp crack. He snapped on the bedside lamp. It was Leo, a bright red handprint already forming on his cheek. Asher demanded to know what he was doing. Leo licked his lips, his gaze predatory. He told Asher that the old cripple was no good, and that he would be the one to love him. Asher could smell the heavy scent of whiskey on him. Leo's eyes were clear, but his mind was clearly gone. Asher shoved him away, asking if he'd lost his mind. Standing in at the wedding was one thing, but did he intend to substitute in the bedroom as well? Leo lunged forward eagerly, insisting he was perfectly capable, that he had all the necessary equipment. It was then that Asher realized his own clothes were in disarray. his body exposed to Leo's gaze. He quickly grabbed a blanket. Leo, overcome by the alcohol, collapsed next to him and began to ramble. He spoke of his regret, of how much he missed Asher, and begged him to take him back, promising he could give him everything his brother could and more. His hands began to wander, sparking fires on Asher's skin. Asher slapped him again, this time on the other cheek, making the red mark symmetrical. He demanded to know what madness this was. It was Leo who had broken up with him, claiming he was bored. They had parted ways amicably, accounts settled. This sudden reappearance made no sense. Suddenly, the quiet whir of a wheelchair came from the doorway. The lame old man from Leo's insults rolled into view, then rose from the chair with an unnerving, fluid grace. A calm voice asked if that was so, remarking that Leo's wish would likely not be granted. He added that attempting to seduce his husband in his presence was rather disrespectful. Hearing Leo call him brother, Asher's brain finally caught up. The handsome man from the bar was Julian Hawthorne, and he was no cripple. His legs were perfectly fine. Leo sobered slightly, scrambling up from the bed and hastily arranging his clothes. He stared at Julian in shock, stammering about his return, about his legs. Julian walked slowly and deliberately into the room, his leather shoes making soft sounds on the floor. He stated that it was his wedding night. Of course the groom would be present. He walked directly to Asher's side of the bed and murmured his name. Asher froze. The handsome face was inches from his own, and the memory of last night's drunken encounter flooded back. How he had flirted, boasted, and threatened to have his way with this very man. It was a moment of supreme social death. He wished the floor would swallow him whole. Julian chuckled softly, asking if he had forgotten what he'd said last night. He had even told him his name was Hawthorne. Asher's mind felt like sludge. How had he not put it together? There were only so many prominent Hawthornes in the city. He raised a hand in awkward surrender, claiming he remembered nothing, that he had been too drunk. With that, he dove under the covers, burying his face in the pillows as tears of humiliation soaked the fine linen. But he kept his ears pricked, listening to the unfolding drama. Julian addressed his brother, asking if he intended to stay. He informed Leo that they were about to engage in activities appropriate for a married couple, and that listening in all night might be more than he could handle. After a pause, he added that he felt Leo might find it particularly upsetting. Leo shot back angrily that Asher had loved him for 3 years and still had feelings for him, calling Julian an unloved third wheel. Julian, adjusting his glasses, was unperturbed. He stated coolly that it didn't matter. He was Asher's husband now. Leo pressed on, boasting that he knew all of Asher's preferences, his favorite positions, his most sensitive spots. Julian's expression remained placid. He repeated, "I am his husband now." Leo's face flushed with rage. He turned to leave, spitting out curses and vowing that he wouldn't give up, that Asher would be his again eventually. As Leo stumbled out, Julian delivered a final, devastating blow. "From now on," he said, "when you see him, you should address him as your sister-in-law." A strangled sob was the only reply as Leo fled the room. Asher couldn't help but let out a small laugh from under the covers. He had never seen Leo so thoroughly defeated. In their time together, it was always Asher doing the placating. As he laughed, the covers were suddenly pulled away. Julian stood over him, looking down. He said Asher's name, and Asher's eyes were immediately drawn to his legs. The dark trousers fit perfectly, accentuating their long, powerful lines. He couldn't understand how such a perfect pair of legs could have been the subject of such vicious rumors. Noticing his stare, Julian leaned closer, his voice a low whisper in Asher's ear. "Husband." The word sent a jolt through him, and a blush crept up his neck. It felt strangely intimate being called that by another man. He coughed and sat up against the headboard, asking what was wrong. Julian's expression turned serious, his voice cooler. He stated that since they were now married, there were some things they needed to discuss regarding the Hawthorne family rules. Asher's relaxed posture tensed. Leo's drama had made him forget the dangerous reputation of the family he had just married into. The rumors about Julian, that he was ruthless, cruel, a killer, suddenly seemed plausible as he looked at the serious man before him. He wondered if he was about to meet a gruesome end on his wedding night. Julian's crisp voice broke the silence. He thought it was his duty to know about the things Leo had said, as he did not wish for there to be any disharmony between them in the bedroom. Furthermore, he explained, his needs were quite significant. He asked if Asher could accept a schedule of 5 times a week. He also added that as his husband, Asher had the right to know everything about the Hawthorne family and could do whatever he pleased. His freedom would not be restricted, as long as he came home each night. Asher was momentarily stunned. He wasn't going to be murdered. He was going to be screwed to death. 5 times a week. He pictured himself withering away in a nursing home, being abused by orderlies. He wondered if that was the real reason for the rumors about his leg, that he had simply worn it out from debauchery. Despite the man's stunning looks and magnificent physique, Asher knew his future happiness depended on him taking a stand. Julian didn't seem as terrifying as the stories suggested. Asher studied his face carefully and spoke with cautious diplomacy. He suggested that perhaps such a schedule was a bit excessive, and that for the sake of their mutual health, a more moderate approach might be better. Julian's long fingers loosened his tie, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Fine," he said. "Whatever you say." They settled on 3 times a week. Asher silently thanked his own quick thinking for saving him. Julian went to take a shower. Asher waited for a while, but when he didn't come out, exhaustion from the long day took over, and he fell asleep, completely forgetting what was supposed to happen on his wedding night. In a hazy dream, he heard a loud crash, but he was too deep in sleep to register it as anything more than a dream. He woke the next morning to an empty, cold space beside him. Where was Julian? Where had his ridiculously handsome new husband gone? His phone was flooded with messages from Caleb, who had been afraid to disturb their wedding night bliss and was now demanding to know all the sordid details. He asked if the crippled husband was functional and if Asher was at home or in the hospital. He also offered to introduce Asher to a new guy he was sure he would love. Asher typed back furiously. He explained that he had fallen asleep and that Julian hadn't touched him. He then added the stunning reveal. His husband was the gorgeous man they had met at the bar. He felt like he should buy a lottery ticket. Caleb's replies stopped. Then, a single question mark appeared. He speculated that maybe Julian was all show and no go. He found it unbelievable that any man could resist Asher, suggesting something was definitely wrong. Asher fell silent too. Could it be true? Julian had looked so impressive, but perhaps he was hiding a problem. Maybe that's why he had hidden in the bathroom all night and made those outrageous demands about 5 times a week. To think such a beautiful man with such a perfect body was letting it all go to waste. It was a crime against nature. After washing up, he went downstairs. The staff had prepared a lavish breakfast. Julian was sitting in his wheelchair, gazing out the window. Hearing Asher's footsteps, he turned. "You're awake." Asher, filled with a strange sense of pity, walked over to him and patted his shoulder, assuring him that he understood. It was fine, he said, they would get it fixed. He then proceeded to instruct the kitchen to prepare a steady diet of oysters, steak, and asparagus soup, anything rumored to boost virility. At lunch, Asher made sure all the special dishes were placed directly in front of Julian. Julian's eyes darkened as he looked at the food, his lips pressed into a thin line. He clearly understood the implication. Asher, meanwhile, was devouring his own meal with gusto. He hadn't eaten this well in months, having survived on instant ramen and cheap takeout. Tears of gratitude welled in his eyes. If not for this marriage, he'd probably be washing dishes in some greasy diner. Feeling a renewed sense of purpose, he piled more oysters onto Julian's plate. Julian's face was black enough to be used for calligraphy. He asked what this was all about. Asher, busy eating, blurted out his thoughts without thinking. He told Julian not to feel insecure, that he didn't mind his condition. They would just eat well and build him back up. He added that there was no need to hide in the bathroom all night. Julian's eyebrow twitched, a dangerous glint in his eye. He said, his voice laced with menace, that perhaps he had given Asher the wrong impression last night. He promised that tonight, Asher would have the chance to personally verify whether he was functional or not. Just then, a doctor arrived with a medical bag. The two men began discussing the condition of Julian's leg right in front of him. Asher sat awkwardly, not knowing where to look. He heard Julian explain to the doctor that he had fallen the previous night. He could stand for longer periods recently, but it was still painful and unstable. Listening to their conversation, Asher realized he had made a terrible mistake. Julian's leg hadn't fully healed. He had been pushing himself to maintain an image and had re-injured it when he fell in the bathroom. Now he temporarily couldn't stand at all. Looking at his swollen, bruised leg, Asher was flooded with guilt. If only he hadn't slept so soundly, he would have known something was wrong. He apologized profusely, calling himself an inadequate husband and admitting he had even doubted his performance. He was relieved, at least, that it was only his leg that wasn't working. His future sexual happiness was, it seemed, still secure. Leo, who had appeared from nowhere, laughed with undisguised glee. He taunted Julian for his vanity, for trying to hide his disability from Asher, and now paying the price. He sneered that a cripple should stay in his wheelchair. He then turned to Asher with a suggestive wink, offering to help take care of his new husband. A sharp glare from Julian finally silenced him. It turned out Julian had missed the wedding because of a sudden complication with his leg that required a trip to the hospital. With the ceremony already planned and guests arrived, Leo had taken it upon himself to step in, with his typical lack of propriety. In the following days, Julian was consumed with work, and Asher decided to find a job of his own. At an interview, he was shocked to see Caleb, dressed in a sharp suit, bowing and scraping before a stone-faced executive. After his interview, Asher cornered him, asking if the executive was his new target. Caleb sighed, explaining that the man was an ex-boyfriend who was forcing him to be his assistant under threat of ruining his career in the city. Asher was incredulous, wondering how Caleb had kept such a powerful connection a secret. Caleb was evasive, promising to explain later once he had figured things out himself. Asher knew his friend well. Despite his carefree exterior, Caleb was stubborn. He must have truly loved this man to let himself be manipulated like this. Caleb changed the subject, asking about Asher's handsome husband. Asher could only sigh. It was hard to believe they had been married for nearly a week without any deep communication. It was partly due to Julian's leg, and partly due to that idiot Leo. One evening, the mood had been perfect, and they were finally about to consummate their marriage when Leo burst into the room without knocking, shouting that there was an emergency at the company. In their haste, they had forgotten to lock the door. Asher quickly covered himself as Julian's face contorted with fury. He roared at Leo to get out, threatening to dismember him and feed him to the dogs if he ever set foot in their room again. Leo looked apologetic, but a flash of triumph glinted in his eyes. He apologized for the interruption and then, turning to Asher, remarked with a smirk that there was no need to be shy, as he was more familiar with every inch of Asher's body than his brother was. The next second, a water glass flew from Julian's nightstand and shattered on the floor near Leo's feet. Julian warned him to know his limits. Leo had always been malicious, but Asher was surprised he dared to be so brazen in front of Julian. He continued to make lewd remarks with a smug grin, finally sauntering out of the room. The mood was thoroughly ruined. Caleb listened to the story with a sigh. He then asked why Asher was even looking for a job when the Hawthorns could easily support him. He joked that maybe his new husband was a cheapskate. The truth was, despite his new status, Asher's personal bank account was still overdrawn. Julian had paid off his family's debts, which was a huge sum, and Asher felt he couldn't ask for more. As he was complaining, a chill ran down his spine. Caleb's expression shifted from amusement to alarm as he frantically motioned with his eyes. Asher turned around. Julian was standing right behind him, a barely perceptible smile on his lips. A wave of cold dread washed over him. He mouthed to Caleb, asking if he had said anything bad about Julian. Caleb just shook his head. The stone-faced executive appeared and grabbed Caleb by the collar, asking if he was paying him a $30,000 a month salary to gossip during work hours. He dragged a protesting Caleb away. Asher looked up sheepishly at Julian, praying he hadn't heard anything. Julian said nothing about it, simply glanced at his watch and said it was time to go home. In the car, Asher sat pressed against the window, trying to create as much distance as possible from Julian's powerful presence. Julian noticed his small movements and glanced at him. He asked if Asher was afraid of him. Asher shook his head, denying it, though his heart was pounding with the guilt of being caught bad-mouthing him. Julian pointed out that they could fit an elephant between them. Asher, despite the terrible joke, obediently scooted a few inches closer. Julian suddenly raised the partition between the front and back seats. As he moved nearer, Asher's body stiffened. Julian's unique, clean scent reached him first. His voice was soft when he spoke. He told Asher he hoped they could communicate like a normal couple. He encouraged Asher to tell him things directly, promising to do his best to accommodate him, admitting that he sometimes got too busy and might forget things. Asher nodded enthusiastically, relieved that he wasn't being scolded. They talked for the rest of the ride, with Julian leading the conversation. He was articulate and elegant, a world away from the broke, spoiled heir Asher had become. Yet, speaking with him was comfortable. He was respectful and engaging. At one point, he pulled several black CR cards from his suit pocket. He explained that they were his personal cards and that the pin was their wedding date. He told Asher to use them freely, without reservation. He reminded him that they were legally married, and their finances should be shared. Holding the stack of cards, Asher felt a new wave of affection for Julian. The power of money was indeed a potent thing. When they arrived at their destination, the driver retrieved the wheelchair from the trunk. Asher got out to help Julian. His leg had improved, but it wasn't fully healed yet. Asher looked up at the glittering facade of the building before them. Two large words were emblazoned on it: Hotel. A blush crept up his neck. Julian saw his reaction and gave a small, knowing smile, asking what he thought they were doing there. Asher understood immediately. He coughed, asking why they weren't at home, mentioning the risk of hidden cameras in hotels. Julian reassured him that it was a Hawthorne hotel. No one would dare, except perhaps Julian himself. Asher then asked about his leg. Julian replied that he had checked with the doctor, and this level of activity was permissible. Despite his reputation as a seasoned player, Asher felt his cheeks burn. This was the first time he had ever discussed such matters so frankly, and with his husband of just a few days. He agreed, and Julian slowly rose from the wheelchair, leaning in to kiss him. Mindful of his leg, Asher rose on his toes to meet him. From the first moment he saw Julian, he had been captivated by his face and physique. He was a man who followed his physical desires, and he readily surrendered to the moment. The curtains were drawn, leaving only a single lamp casting shifting shadows across the room. This time, there were no interruptions from Leo. The night was a resounding success. Asher also discovered a new side to Julian. He was cunning, even incorporating the wheelchair into their activities, to the point where Asher could no longer look at it without blushing. By the time Leo, drawn by some sixth sense, arrived, the battle was over. When the door opened, he was crouched on the floor like a stray dog. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes red-rimmed and fixed on Asher's hand, which was held tightly in Julian's. He stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. Julian didn't spare him a glance. As they passed, Leo grabbed Asher's other arm, his voice cracking. He asked if things might have been different if he had been the one to marry him, if Julian wasn't in the picture. Julian shoved his hand away, his voice sharp with. He told Leo that his patience, extended only because of their shared bloodline, was wearing thin. But Leo's desperate gaze remained fixed on Asher, like an abandoned puppy. Asher looked at him and felt only a cold amusement. He told Leo to stop his pathetic act, reminding him that he still owed him an explanation for his past behavior and that he was only humiliating himself. The answer, he said, was one Leo had given him long ago. The usually glib Leo was stunned into silence, his face pale with regret. He watched them walk away, whispering to himself that he regretted it all. When Asher went to visit his mother in the hospital, Julian accompanied him. As they entered the room, his mother's eyes filled with tears. She struggled to speak, her voice raspy. Before her illness, she had doted on Asher. Now, lying in the hospital bed, her hair was streaked with gray and her face lined with pain, but her former beauty was still evident. She had been a famous beauty in her youth, also married into a family through an arrangement with Asher's father, a brash but devoted man from New Money. She had lived a comfortable life. Because of the bankruptcy and the wedding, Asher hadn't been to see her in days. His father had been staying at the hospital, caring for her. Asher's eyes welled up as he called out to her. His parents didn't know about the bankruptcy or the arranged marriage. They had wanted to spare her the worry. Asher introduced Julian as his boyfriend, telling her they were getting married soon and that she had to get well for the wedding. A smile touched his mother's lips. She was clearly pleased with Julian, who was warm and patient with her, assuring her and Asher's father that he would take good care of their son. The room filled with a warmth it hadn't had in a long time. Asher was moved that Julian would spend a whole afternoon in a hospital room, charming his parents. He was nothing like the rumors. He had been nothing but kind. When it was time to leave, his mother shooed Asher and his father out of the room, asking Julian to stay behind for a private word. Julian squeezed Asher's hand reassuringly. Standing in the hallway, his father asked quietly if Julian was good to him. Asher nodded, patting his stomach to show he'd even been gaining weight. He leaned in and whispered that Julian had even given him all his bank card pins. His father patted his shoulder, satisfied. A few minutes later, Julian emerged. In the car, Asher eagerly asked what his mother had said. Julian just smiled mysteriously, saying it was a secret between him and his mother-in-law. Asher pouted, arguing that as her son and his husband, he was part of that circle too, but Julian playfully refused. Still, Asher was happy. He could see how much it meant to his parents that he was being well cared for. He thanked Julian sincerely. His mother's treatment was expensive, and without Julian, he couldn't imagine the hell his life would be right now. Julian told him never to say thank you. He said that Asher still didn't understand that he wasn't an outsider. He wanted to be needed, to know Asher's real thoughts, but most of all, he just wanted to be good to him. Looking into Julian's mesmerizing eyes, Asher's heart began to race. Perhaps this was the beginning of something real. He lamented that he couldn't do anything to help Julian in return. Julian gently pulled him into an embrace, stroking his hair. He said that just being there was all he needed. To wake up and see him, to hold him when he was tired, that was enough. He confessed that just seeing Asher improved his mood. He held him tighter and asked if he could feel his heart beating. The strong, steady rhythm against his ear echoed in his own chest. He realized then that Julian liked him too. Their life together grew sweeter. Julian's leg healed almost completely, and as two men in their prime, the spark between them was easily ignited. Their happiness soared. Of course, there was still the problem of Leo, who descended into a drunken stupor, constantly sending Asher harassing messages. Asher blocked him, so Leo started sending them to Julian instead. Julian, having reached his limit, had Leo transferred to a remote branch of the company in some forgotten corner of the country. Before he left, Leo came to see Asher one last time. He pleaded for another chance, swearing he would do better than his brother, offering all his money, and vowing never to lie again. It was only then that Asher finally understood the root of the conflict between the brothers. The Hawthorne parents had been killed in a car accident orchestrated by an enemy. Julian's legs were injured in the same crash. The news was kept from Leo, who was studying abroad, and he never got to see his parents one last time. He blamed Julian for this and left home upon his return. Julian, feeling a sliver of guilt and wanting to protect his impulsive brother from the true, violent details of their parents' deaths, had let him go. It was only after Julian had dealt with the men responsible that he told Leo the truth. By then, the proud and stubborn Leo refused to come home. He burned through his money and ended up meeting Asher. At the time, Asher's family was still wealthy. He was drawn to Leo's wild energy, his dyed red hair and fiery temper. He had used his money to get Leo into his bed. Leo had stayed for 3 years, costing him a small fortune, until one day he announced he was bored. He claimed he had always preferred women and had just been experimenting. He mocked Asher for thinking he could buy affection, revealing that his own family was far wealthier. He had just been playing a game, and now it was over. He had transferred a large sum of money to Asher, but Asher, realizing with a shock that he had fallen for him, refused to take a cent. He had simply told Leo to get out and had blocked him on everything. Looking at the broken man before him now, devoid of his former arrogance, Asher spoke coldly. He asked if Leo had forgotten what he'd said, and if he honestly believed Asher could ever love him again. Leo's face went white. He begged for a chance to make amends, even offering to be a third in their relationship, claiming he would be better for Asher and that Julian would surely allow it. He confessed he had regretted his actions for years. Asher looked down at the simple, matching band on his finger. It was engraved with the letters JH. A corresponding ring, engraved with AC, was on Julian's hand. He told Leo it was too late. He no longer loved him. He loved his brother now and always would. The moment Leo had deceived him, any love he had felt was extinguished. Julian had been good to him, and he had fallen for him in return. He fiddled with the letters on the ring, telling Leo that his brother was a jealous man and that he should not contact him again. He was a person who loved fiercely and moved on completely. Love didn't disappear. It simply transferred to someone more deserving. He later learned that Julian had orchestrated the entire marriage. Julian had first seen him at the scene of that fateful car crash. It had been raining heavily, and Asher, on his way to meet Caleb, had come across the accident. He had pulled the family from the wreckage. The parents were unconscious, but Julian was awake. Asher had taken them to the hospital, paid for everything, and left. He had forgotten the incident, but Julian never did. He remembered the brave young man who had saved his life. He found out everything about him and engineered several chance encounters, but Asher never recognized him. When he learned of the Collins family's bankruptcy, he went to Asher's father and proposed the marriage. But he had insisted the final choice be Asher's. If Asher had refused, Julian would still have paid off the family's debts and found another way into his life. When he heard Asher had agreed, he had rushed the wedding, afraid his future husband might get away. And the conversation in the hospital room? His mother, perceptive as ever, had told Julian she knew who he was. She had asked him why, with his background, he would choose her son. She had begged him not to play with Asher's heart if he wasn't serious. Julian had looked her in the eye and sworn that his feelings for Asher were genuine, that he would love him for the rest of his life. He promised to give him everything, to protect him with his own life, because Asher had saved his. His mother had been moved to tears of relief. Late one night, thinking about all of this, Asher woke Julian up. He poked him in the ribs. "Julian," he whispered, "I love you. What about you? Do you love this handsome guy with long legs, a narrow waist, and a great ass?" Julian pulled him close and captured his lips in a soft kiss. "You already know the answer to that, husband." He wondered if they would be happy. Yes, he thought. They certainly would.